Julius Caesar, 2026. Introduction. William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. William Shakespeare was an English playwright, poet, and actor, widely regarded as one of the greatest writers in the English language and one of the most influential dramatists in world history, often referred to as the Bard of Avon, or the Bard for short. Shakespeare produced an extraordinary body of work, including collaborations, including approximately 39 plays, 154 sonnets, and several long narrative poems. His influence on literature, theater, and the English language remains unmatched. His plays have been translated into every major living language and continue to be performed more often than those of any other playwright. Shakespeare's writing career is usually divided into several major phases. During the earliest part of his career, he wrote comedies and histories, many of which focused on mistaken identities, political conflict, royal succession, and the instability of power. Later, he entered his great tragic period, producing some of the most famous works, including Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. In his final years, Shakespeare turned towards tragic comedies, sometimes called late romances, such as The Winter's Tale and The Tempest. Among his most enduring political tragedies is Julius Caesar, believed to have been written and performed in around 1599. Although Julius Caesar may not have the same popular romantic frame as Romeo and Juliet, it remains one of Shakespeare's most important and widely studied plays. While Romeo and Juliet focuses largely on personal emotion, youthful passion, family conflict, and tragic love, Julius Caesar deals directly with power, leadership, political violence, public persuasion, and the collapse of a republic. It is a play about what happens when one man becomes too powerful, when the ruling class becomes too afraid, and when the people are forced to choose between liberty, order, and ambition. The play dramatizes the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar, the Roman dictator, and the violent political consequences that follow his death. It moves from Caesar's rise in power to the fear of the Roman senators to the assassination on the ideas of March, and finally to the civil war between the conspirators and Caesar's supporters. Historically, these events contributed to the final collapse of the Roman Republic and the rise of imperial rule under Octavian, later known as Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. In Shakespeare's version, however, the story is not about history. It is about morality, persuasion, betrayal, and the terrifying uncertainty of political action. Although the play is named after Julius Caesar, many critics argue that Marcus Brutus is the true tragic hero. Caesar dominates the world of the play, but Brutus carries much of its emotional and moral weight. His conflict is not simple hatred or jealousy. Instead, Brutus struggles between his personal love for Caesar and his belief that Caesar's growing power may destroy the Roman Republic. This makes him one of Shakespeare's most complex characters. He does not kill Caesar because he sees himself as evil. He kills Caesar because he convinces himself that murder can be transformed into sacrifice if it is done for Rome. The central critical debate focuses on whether Caesar or Brutus is the true protagonist, a question complicated by the play's conflicting political ideologies, between republicanism alongside monarchism and aristocracy. Through Brutus, Shakespeare explores one of the central questions of the tragedy. Can violence ever be justified in the name of political freedom? The conspirators believe they are saving Rome from tyranny, but their actions unleash even greater chaos. Caesar's death does not restore the Republic. Instead, it creates a power vacuum that leads to manipulation, mob violence, war, and eventually the rise of an even stronger form of centralized power. In this way, Julius Caesar becomes a warning about the fragility of political systems and the danger of believing that one dramatic act can repair a broken state. Julius Caesar was written during the final years of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, a period of deep political anxiety in England. Elizabeth had no direct heir and refused for many years to publicly name a successor. This created widespread fear that her death could lead to instability, factional conflict, or even civil war. Against this background, Shakespeare's play about the assassination of a powerful ruler and the chaos that follows would have felt especially urgent to Elizabethan audiences. The fall of Caesar was not merely an ancient Roman event, it reflected contemporary fears about secession, national unity, and the dangers of a power vacuum. Shakespeare drew heavily from Parallel Lives, a collection of biographies written by the Greco-Roman Middle Platonist, historian, biographer, essayist, and priest and philosopher from Apollo, Plutarch, in the early 2nd century CE. In particular, Shakespeare used the 1579 English translation of Plutarch's work by the English military officer, lawyer, justice of the peace officer, and translator Sir Thomas North as a major source for Julius Caesar, called The Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romaenes. This is really off topic, but this is like a very like archaic slash outdated translation of saying Greeks and Romans, Grecians and Romaenes. That sounds really racist in my opinion. Well, don't get me wrong. The Hellenic Republic, aka modern Greece, is definitely not the same of any of the ancient Greek states that ever existed. And the Ro- and, Ro- and the Roman and the Roman period was certainly not the same as is certainly not the same thing as the modern day country of Italy. But Grecians and Romaenes, with no context at all, that sounds really racist in my opinion. Imagine being called a Romaini. Okay, I'll stop. Let's get back on topic. Plutarch's biographies of antiquity figures, and specifically in this case, Caesar, Brutus, and Antony, give Shakespeare much of the material he needed to shape the plot, develop the characters, and dramatize the major events of the story. Shakespeare closely followed Plutarch in several key moments, including the warnings about the ideas of March, Calpurnia's dream, Decius Brutus persuading Caesar to go to the Senate, the assassination itself, and the eventual defeat of the conspirators. However, Shakespeare did not simply copy history. He reshaped it for dramatic effect. He compressed timelines, rearranged events, intensified conflicts, and transformed historical figures into theatrical characters with sharper emotional and political roles. Plutarch rep- Plutarch presented Brutus as honorable but conflicted, while Cassius appeared more personally resentful and politically calculating. Shakespeare used his contrast to create one of the play's most important relationships, the uneasy partnership between a moral idealist and a practical conspirator. Brutus gives the conspiracy its noble image, while Cassius gives its dangerous momentum. The play's central critical debate often focuses on whether Caesar or Brutus should be considered the true protagonist. Caesar is the title character, and his power drives the fear, loyalty, hatred, and worship surrounding him. Yet Brutus receives the deepest moral examination. The tragedy depends on his decision, his self-deception, and his eventual downfall. This question is complicated by the political ideas within the play itself. Is Caesar a tyrant who must be stopped? Is Brutus a patriot who makes a terrible mistake? Is Antony a loyal friend, a brilliant manipulator, or both? Shakespeare refuses to give easy answers. That moral ambiguity is one of the reasons Julius Caesar has remained so powerful. The play does not present politics as a simple battle between good and evil. Instead, it shows a world where every major character is partly right and partly blind. Caesar may be ambitious, but he is also a stabilizing force. Brutus may be honorable, but he's also dangerously naive. Cassius may be selfish and bitter, but his fears about Caesar are not entirely baseless. Antony may grieve sincerely, but he also uses grief as a weapon. The result is a tragedy where noble intentions produce disaster and where public language becomes a tool for control and reality. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is also one of the most important studies of rhetoric. Speeches decide the fate of Rome as much as swords do. Brutus uses reason, honor, and public duty to justify the assassination. Antony uses grief, repetition, and emotional pressure to turn the Roman crowd against the conspirators. The famous funeral scene demonstrates the dangerous power of language in politics. A crowd can be calmed, persuaded, inflamed, and redirected by the right speaker at the right moment. In this sense, the play remains deeply relevant to modern audiences, especially in an age shaped by mass communication, propaganda, public image, and political performance. Scholars generally place the composition of Julius Caesar around 1599. The play was not included in Swiss essayists, physician and traveler Francis Marers. I don't know how do you say his last name. Sorry if I mispronounce his name. Francis Marer's 1598 list of Shakespeare's known works, suggesting it had not become widely recognized at that time. However, a diary from September 1599 by the Swiss traveler Thomas Plater records a performance of a tragedy about Julius Caesar, which many scholars associate with Shakespeare's play. Although Julius Caesar was not officially printed until the first folio in 1623, its language and style place it near other works from the same period, including Henry V, As You Like It, and Hamlet. Julius Caesar is a modernized third-person reimagining of Shakespeare's classic tragedy. Rather than presenting the story as a stage play, this This very loose version transforms it into a cinematic, historical novel designed for a modern audience. It keeps the central political and emotional conflicts of Shakespeare's tragedy while expanding the world around him with greater detail, atmosphere, historical context, and narrative pacing. The goal is to make the fall of the Roman Republic feel immediate, vivid, and understandable to readers who may be encountering Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, and Octavian in a new way. This adaptation follows the transition from the late Roman Republic towards the birth of the Roman Empire, beginning in the aftermath of Caesar's final victories and moving towards his return to Rome, his growing dominance, his assassination on the ideas of March, and the civil war that follows. Like Shakespeare's original tragedy, Julius Caesar 2026 explores a dangerous relationship between public loyalty and private ambition. It examines how governments collapse, how leaders become symbols, how crowds are manipulated, and how men convince themselves, sorry, not conceive, convince themselves that violence can be noble. At its center, this novelization remains a story about power. Caesar's rise threatens the old order, but the old order itself is corrupt, frightened, and decaying. The senators feared tyranny, yet many of them are also defending their own privilege. The people love Caesar, but their love can be redirected by spectacle and speech. The soldiers worship strength, while the politicians worship tradition. Between these forces stands Rome itself, ancient, crowded, unstable, proud, and ready to be remade by whoever can control its future. Julius Caesar 2026 therefore uses Shakespeare's tragedy as both foundation and inspiration. It preserves the original play's central themes of ambition, betrayal, honor, rhetoric, and political violence, while presenting them through the broader lens of historical fiction. This result is a retelling that connects the ancient world to modern concerns about leadership, propaganda, dictatorship, loyalty, and the collapse of democratic institutions. Like the original play, this adaptation asks a question that remains difficult to answer. When the Republic begins to fall, who is truly responsible? The man who seizes power, the people who give it to him, or the elites who failed to protect it before he arrived? Prologue. Cordoba, near Lanti, Lantijulia, Spain, March 17th, 45 BCE. Oh, sorry, let me start that over. That part. Near Lanajula, sorry, near Lanajula, Spain, March 17th, 45 BCE, late afternoon. Under the harsh glare of the late afternoon sun, the Andalusian wilderness near Lantejulia transformed into a shimmering tapestry of gold and shadow. The intense heat flattened the horizon, drawing a hazy veil over the distant Sierras and turning the scrublands into a restless sea of brittle, swaying grasses. This parched, desert-like expanse stretched for miles, a sun-scorched badlands punctuated by hardy subshrubs, winter blooms, and a lonely, jagged silhouette of occasional oak trees. The flat terrain was broken only by small groves and scattered citrus trees, which eventually surrendered to denser forests of pine and deciduous oak. These lush corridors clung to the riverways, winding through the countryside, offering a stark, emerald contrast to the furnace-like heat of the southern Spanish plains. Along the banks, an occasional palm tree stood sentimental above the shorter brush. The rivers themselves were wide and shallow, their cool waters flowing with smooth, rhythmic gentleness. Above, the sun hung heavy in a cloudless expanse, casting a relentless, vibrating glare across the earth. With little vegetation to shield the ground, the air, stripped of all humidity, felt thin and bone dry. In the far distance, the barren, jagged outlines of hills rose like ghosts against the sky. Near the water's edge stood the black Andalusian mare named Arcadia. Sorry. I was a little lost for a moment. Sorry. She was a powerhouse of a horse, possessed of a broad back, powerful hindquarters, built for sudden leaps, and a thick, well-arched neck. Her head was noble and strong, featuring the intelligent, muscular chest and wide jaws. Behind her obsidian keys lay a keen, observant intelligence that seemed to mirror her master's. She was outfitted in the full war gear. A plated bronze chamfron guarded her forehead, complemented by a heavy pectoral, eye guards, and hinged knee plates. Her saddle was a masterpiece of woven leather and fringed blankets, a functional epiphysium designed for the riggers of high command. The flat terrain was broken only by small groves and scattered citrus trees, which eventually gave way to denser forests of pine and deciduous oak. These lush corridors clung to the riverways, winding across the countryside, offering a stark, shaded contrast to the furnace-like heat of the southern Spanish plains. Along the along the banks, an occasional palm tree stood sentinel above the shorter brush. The rivers themselves were wide and shallow, their cool waters flowing with a smooth, calming gentleness. Above, the sun hung heavy in a cloudless expanse, casting a relentless glare across the earth. With little vegetation to shield the ground, the air, stripped of all humidity, felt thin and bone dry, vibrating under under sorry under the intensity of the midday furnace. In the far distance, the barren, jagged outlines of hills rose like ghosts in the horizon. Oh crap! Sorry about that. That was just like an earlier version. Sorry, like in the earlier version of that paragraph. I forgot to delete that. My bad. Her owner, Julius Caesar, sat nearby on a weather no wait, sorry. On a weather-worn tree stump. Before him, his journal, a bottle of ink, and a feathered pen. At 55, Caesar was a man of striking, formidable presence. He had rather short, Asian brown hair. Oh, it's yeah. He was sorry. Oh, hold on. There was a typo. Sorry. Sorry. Sorry about the last minute change. Hold on. Sorry. Sorry. At 55, Caesar was a man of striking, formidable presence. He was a bald individual alongside a head that was held high, his face marked by a jagged scar on the right side. His jawlines remained chiseled and sharp, a testament to a lifetime of discipline. He wore the full panoply of a Dux Magnus, his steel helmet currently resting nearby or held steady, sported a transverse chest of vibrant red plumes. His chestplate was a work of highly decorated steel, featuring shoulder padding that signaled his supreme rank, while Petruges Thick fabric straps hung from his waist over planted military trousers. A, a massive scarlet cloak draped over his back like a spill of bloods against the parched earth. Upon his armor, the Roman eagle draped a halberd above the letters SBQR, all encircled by a victor's olive crown. Sweating profusely and exhausted from the day's slaughter, Caesar began to speak as he wrote, his voice in a low rasp in the dry air. My name is Gaius Julius Caesar. He murmured, This is my newest journal from the field. I am a general, a statesman, and an author, but above all, I am the dictator of Rome. I command the 13th Legion, the Legio 13th Gemina, as my iron hand. He paused, the pen scratching across the vellum. I was born of the patricians, a family descended from the goddess Venus, of virtue, love, peace, prosperity, and beauty herself. We trace our bloods long ago to Alba Longa, before it was razed by the third king of Rome. I have held the dictatorship for 4 centuries now. Since the year I crossed the Rubicon and seized the heart of the Republic, through popularity, manipulation, and the sheer weight of my allegiance. He dipped his pen. I am a member of the Triumvirate. My first taste of blood was at the siege of Mytilene 36 years ago in 81 BCE. During the Second Mytilenian War, I tamed the wilds of Gaul in mainland Western Europe for 8 years, between 58 BCE to 50 BCE in the Gallic Wars. And now I find myself in a civil war against the sons of my old ally turned foe, Pompey. Not Pompeii, Pompey. Just as a reminder, it's Pompey, not Pompeii, not the city that got fucking blown up by that one volcano, Mount Vesuvius or whatever it's called. Not that. This dude's completely different, completely unrelated. Just as like a friendly reminder. But let's continue. Caesar looked out toward the distant hills, a grim smile touching his lips. The Battle of Munda was The Battle of Munda was fought on this day. It lasted 8 grueling hours. We and our Mauritanian allies stood against 13 legions led by Gnaeus Pompeius. We were outnumbered, 50,000 of my veterans against 70,000 of theirs. Despite his fatigue, Caesar let out a short, dry chuckle. We won decisively. The Pompeians have lost 30,000 men this day. My own losses stand at a mere 1,000, with only 500 wounded. Even at the brink, victory chose me. His voice grew serious again as he returned to his writing. This, I believed, is the final movement of this god-forsaken war. The fighting was so intense, I was forced to leave my post and fight in the mud alongside my men, but the line held. A single tactical error broke the Pompeians, and the slaughter began. He looked at the drying ink, the weight of the future settling on his shoulders. The war is over. Rome is mine. Caesar continued to chronicle his thoughts, his voice low and steady. Nearly 4 years have passed since that January in 49 BCE, when I led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon. So I didn't know. I honestly just forgot if I said 13th or 30th, but it was 13th, not 30th. If I mispronounced it earlier. My bad. My bad if I did. By crossing from Cisalpine Gaul into Italy, I defied the laws of Imperium and made armed conflict inevitable. But this was all by design, a necessary spark to light the forge. After marching on Rome and forcing Pompey to flee towards Greece, not Rome, sorry, I secured my first appointment as dictator, a brief 11-day tenure that ensured my election as consul. He paused, the scratch of his pen the only sound in a dry afternoon air. I broke Pompey's spirit at Pharsalus and dismantled the remaining senatorial forces led by Cato in the battles that followed. Now we have destroyed the last great army of the Optimates opposition here in Iberia, with the deaths of Titus Labienus and Gnaeus Pompeius the Younger. Large-scale resistance to my authority has been extinguished. The path back to Rome is finally clear. Caesar looked out towards the distant hills, a grim smile touching his lips. The Battle of Munda was fought on this day. It lasted It lasted eight grueling hour. It lasted eight grueling hours. We and our Mauritanian allies stood against 13 legions led by Gnaeus Pompeius. We were outnumbered 50,000 of my veterans against 70,000 of theirs. Despite his fatigue, Caesar allowed a short, dry chuckle, recapping. We won decisively. The Pompeians have lost 30,000 men this day. My own losses stood at a mere thousand. Even at the brink, victory chose me. This was the final movement of this godforsaken war. The fighting was so intense, I was forced to fight in the mud alongside my men. But the line held. A single tactical error, as stated, broke the Pompeians, and the slaughter began. The war is over, Rome is mine. He shifted his weight, his eyes drifting towards the river. King Bogut of Mauritania has proven a useful ally. His naval operations scouting the coastline for Pompeian loyalists, but his interest in our cause has reached its end. He has recalled most of his troops to Africa, content to leave the Roman cleanup to Romans. I cannot blame him. His loyalty was never to the Republic, but to victory. Caesar tightened his grip on the pen, adding his final thoughts. Unlike my Mauritanian allies, I will not rush to the capital just yet. I shall spend the coming months here in Hispania. There is much to be done. The total restructuring of the province, the hunt for the fugitive Sextus Pompey, and the pacification of those cities that dared to fly the banner of the opposition. Rome must not only be won, it must be secured. He concluded with a firm stroke of the pen. When I finally return, I shall do as an unchallenged absolute power, no longer a conventional general, but the singular sun around which Rome orbits. I may yet celebrate this victory with a triumph once the last of the loyalists in Africa and Hispania are hunted down. Until then, Caesar nodded to himself, affirming his destiny. He lifted the feather in the air for a moment, watching the ink dry, then shut the journal with a heavy thud. He sealed the ink bottle, tucked his supplies away, and rose from the stump with the stiff grace of a veteran. He walked over to Arcadia, patting her muscled neck before mounting. He adjusted his weight, feeling the familiar shift of the horse beneath him. Grabbing the reins, he leaned forward and whispered, "Let's go, Arcadia." The mare shook her powerful body, her bronze armor clinking, and then thundered off into the golden Andalusian countrysides, leaving only a cloud of dust in the wake of the world's most powerful men. Chapter 1: The Pre-Augustan Rome. 7 months later, October 14th, 45 BCE, late morning. Rome during this time was a chaotic, dense, and rapidly evolving city of brick and concrete rather than marble, characterized by narrow streets, crowded multi-story apartment blocks, insulae, and majestic Republican-era temples. It was a city of extreme contrasts, combining intensity, noisy urban squalor with monumental public centers like the Roman forums. Rome had raised and rather elevated. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry. Rome had raised or rather elevated concrete streets alongside wide, flat, smoothly paved cobblestone city streets. The buildings were mostly made of stone, concrete, terracotta, and stone bricks, and very few buildings were actually marble, andesite, and granite at this time. The streets were lined with multi-storied apartment and condominium complexes called insulae. Alongside the vast and countless insulae complexes were crowded marketplaces, vibrant mausoleums and temples, and other buildings. Several landmarks that define Rome today were either non-existent or looked very different. Famous monuments that defined Rome, such as the Roman Colosseum, would not be constructed for another 120 years. However, there were other iconic landmarks, such as the mostly timber and earth stadium for chariot races, as well as the Roman Forum, the bustling political heart, featuring the Curia, Senate House, the Rostra, Speaker's Platform, and ancient temples like the Temple of Saturn. During this era, in the 1st century BCE, the city walls of Rome were not the massive unbroken barriers of the later empire, but rather the ancient 300-year-old Servian Wall. The Servian Wall was constructed around Rome in the early 4th century BCE, standing up to 10 meters or 33 feet tall in height, 2.6 meters or 12 feet wide at its base, and 11 kilometers or 6.8 miles long around the city and its surroundings. 16 main gates, with only 2 surviving to this day, and an enclosed area of 246 hectares or 610 acres. A Servian wall was built after the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BCE and was a massive high-walled embankment. The Servian wall had imposing gray walls, unlike the much later and more famous red brick Aurelian walls, weathered by centuries, with much of the numerous city gates that acted mostly as customs checkpoints, then and fortified military bottlenecks. The famous red brick, massive 19-kilometer walls, often associated with ancient Rome, are the Aurelian walls, built over 300 years after Caesar in the 270s CE. After 6 months of insurgent fighting against the Pompeian loyalists in the province of Hispania in the Iberian Peninsula to secure the province and oversee political reorganization, Roman dictator Marcus Julius Caesar had finally returned to the city of Rome, once more in a triumph held by the Roman people. While Munda at Lanteluha was the decisive battle that effectively ended this Roman civil war, it did not immediately result in the total elimination of all Pompeian opposition. After the battle, Caesar continued to march, through the region to accept the surrender of towns and hunt down Romanian troops. With the help of Romanian allied Mauritanian troops from King Boud, in the initial few months following the end of the Civil War, the Romanian stations, Mauritanian expeditionary troops, had engaged in naval operations and small land raids and skirmishes against the Romanian Pompeians in North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. However, after several weeks to a few months, the Romanian expeditionary troops were recalled home safely by Boud. Even with the full withdrawal of the Mauritanian military, Caesar and the Roman military continued to march through the region to accept the surrender of towns and hunt down the troops in Hispania. While Caesar focused on wider security, he left his legate, ambassador, or envoy, Quintus Fabius Maximus, to finish the siege of the town of Munda, which surrendered later. Many Pompeian fighters were trapped and still fought ferociously, so while some loyalists like Gnaeus Pompey the Younger fled initially, Caesar's commanders hunted him down, where Gnaeus was caught and killed in the Battle of Lauru. Julius Caesar stayed in the Iberian Peninsula until June 45 BCE, planning administrative restructuring, appointing governors, and founding colonies for his veterans. Following these efforts, Caesar and his army traveled back through Gaul and northern Italy, eventually returning to Rome in October 45 BCE to celebrate a triumph. So while Sextus Pompeius managed to evade capture at the time, Munda destroyed the last major organized army of the Pompeian faction, known as the Optimates, making it the final victory of the war. And because of Caesar's return to Rome from Hispania and the end of Rome's civil war, which had been ongoing for nearly for over 4 years by this point, the proletarian and the plebeians of Rome held a triumph to celebrate Caesar's return to the city. However, the Senate and Rome's conservative patrician families weren't too pleased with the commander. The patricians were the venerable, aristocratic ruling class of ancient Rome, an elite nobility whose lineages often stretched back to the city's founding. Originally a closed, hereditary caste, they held an iron grip on the Senate and sacred religious offices, standing in contrast to the common citizenry, the plebeians, in the early centuries of the Republic. This exclusive status was absolute. Only those of patrician birth could hold high magistracies, command legions, or interpret the divine laws of the state. However, by the late 1st century BCE, the foundations of patrician dominance had begun to crumble. Decades of political struggle, the conflict of the orders, had granted the plebeians significant legal equality. This, combined with the demographic collapse of ancient families through war and low birth rates, led to the rise of the nobilitias, a new aristocracy based on merit, wealth, and military achievement rather than bloodline alone, while the remaining patricians retained immense social prestige and quote, old money influence, their exclusive grasp on the machinery of the new state had vanished, leaving them defensive and deeply suspicious of any rising new man. Julius Caesar famously positioned himself against this patrician-dominated Senate by champion to the popularist faction. Rather than working through the stagnant traditional channels of the elite, Caesar bypassed the Senate by speaking directly to the common people. He leveraged support of the plebeians and the unyielded loyalty of his veterans to dismantle the traditional political and economic structures that had long served the few, using the immense spoils from His Gallic conquests, Caesar funded populist reforms, land redistribution, debt relief, and public spectacles that secured his image as a man of the people. Ultimately, his crossing of the of the Rubicon was the final defiance of a Senate that demanded he surrender the very power the people had helped him build. To further solidify his control, Caesar shrewdly aligned himself with the equestrian order, or equites. This powerful class of wealthy elites ranked just below the senatorial aristocracy. Once the literal cavalry of Rome, the equites had evolved to a formidable business and administrative class. They were the engines of the Roman economy, managing massive tax collection syndicates, international banking, and lucrative government contracts. By bringing the equites into his orbit, Caesar did more than just secure his finances. He gained the support of the very men who possessed the administrative expertise required to run an empire that had grown too large for the old Senate to manage. Though born into an ancient patrician lineage himself, Caesar strategically aligned with the Popularis faction, a political movement that sought to bypass the traditional authority of the aristocratic Senate, known as the Optimates. While the Optimates clung to the established power of the elite, Caesar leveraged the support of the popular assemblies to empower the plebeians. He cemented this populist image through sweeping reforms that addressed the grievances of the land and middle class by enacting significant debt reductions, redistribution. Sorry about that. Sorry. I got a little lost. Sorry. Grievances of the lower and middle class by enacting significant debt reductions, redistributing public lands to the landless, and launching massive public works projects. Public work projects. He didn't just build monuments, he provided essential jobs and lucrative contracts for the equestrian order and commoners alike. These actions transformed him from a mere politician into a savior of the Roman masses. At the heart of Caesar's power was the unwavering, ironclad loyalty of his soldiers. This bond was forged in the forests and trenches of the Gallic Wars, where he spent nearly a decade fighting alongside his men. During his final 2 years of the conflict, as he transitioned from conqueror to administrator, Caesar began implementing direct Roman provincial rule and restructuring the political landscape of Gaul. The Senate watching from Rome grew paralyzed with the Senate watching from Rome grew paralyzed with fear at the sight of a general who possessed both an immense fortune and a veteran army ultimatum demanding he disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen to face certain prosecution. Caesar chose a different path. On the banks of the Rubicon, the boundary between his province and the Roman heartland, he made his fateful decision. By marching his legions into Italy, he committed an act of high treason that shattered the Republic's legal foundations. The crossing was not just a military maneuver, it was the definitive spark that ignited the fires of the Roman Civil War. The patrician elite, specifically the Optimates, largely favored his rival, Pompey, viewing Caesar as a tyrant and a threat to their traditional power structure. Even with the end of Caesar's civil war in the Republic, the tensions were still boiling between the Senate and Julius Caesar and his followers. The beginning of historical influence on Roman civilization had just begun. Oh, sorry about that again. Sorry. Chapter 2: The Patricians and Equestrians. The upper class district of Rome were a worlds apart from the suffocating crush of the lower city. Here, the usual roar of urban life was replaced by a composed, expectant hush. Along the wide cobblestone thoroughfares, the rhythmic scuff of brooms and the scrape of shovels echoed as city sweepers, mostly peasants and former slaves, worked with practiced efficiency. They cleared the dust and debris from the elevated sidewalks, ensuring the path was pristine for the dignitaries and aristocrats who would soon emerge from their villas. On this particular morning, the Mediterranean air lacked its usual bite, while it retained a lingering warmth. It was seasoned with the cooling touch of mid-October, far milder than the sweltering furnace of the Spanish summer. The the atmosphere was thin and dry, carrying a parched quality that felt crisp despite the absence of humidity. Overhead, a partially cloudy sky drifted lazily against the sun. The mountain air was filled with the spirited chirping of birds. A gentle breeze rolled through the neighborhood, coaxing with a small rustle from the carefully manicured trees and lush vegetation that adorned the country yards of the elite. Even in this more refined quarter, the spirit of Roman commerce was alive, albeit on a more modest and orderly scale. Small markets and sidewalk stalls were tucked neatly along the stone-fronted buildings. Merchants and traders, their voices more subdued than the shouting hawkers of the Suburra, offered a variety of essential goods. The scent of freshly baked breads mingled with the earthly aromas of oils, sun-ripened fruits, and the savory tints of roasted meat. Clay amphorae filled with cool water and vintage wine in shaded rows, while nearby a handful of livestock traders displayed their wares. Horses stood tethered and patient alongside cages of cooing doves and clucking chickens. In the larger stalls, small herds of sheep and cattle shifted in their pens, and a few exotic dromedary camels, likely brought with the tides of trade and conquest, stood tall and indifferent. Their presence a silent testament to the vast reaches of Rome's growing shadow. For the moment, the only sound that dominated the morning was the steady, sweeping cadence of the cleaners, preparing the stage for the arrival of the man who had remade the world. There were also occasional pedestrians wandering through the mostly empty city streets, in the heart of Rome. There was also an occasional horse-drawn carriage or wagon passing by, or a citizen riding on horseback to their destination. Moving through the swept streets of the district were two figures who embodied the quiet gravity of the Roman elite. Valens Flavius and his sister, a noblewoman named Julia. Despite the gap in their ages, Valens being in his late 40s and Julia in her late 30s. Their shared lineage was unmistakable. Both possessed a striking angular beauty. characterized by sharpened rhombus, shaped facial structures, and an imposing height that allowed them to look over the heads of the smaller rock crowds. Their hair, a rich and lustrous brown, caught the morning light, while their eyes, as black as polished obsidian, betrayed a keen, calculating intelligence. Valens, a man of significance, standing as a politician, author, and tribune, was dressed in the rigorous uniform of public duty. He wore a ceremonious toga, a massive garment of fine white wool draped with practiced precision over a soft linen tunic. Unlike the coarse, scratchy fabrics favored by the lower class, by the lower orders, Valence's garments were made of the highest quality weave, marking him instantly as a man of the patrician class. On his feet, he wore a formal leather calcii, the specialized footwear of the Roman aristocracy, which clicked with quiet authority against the cobblestones. Beside him, Julia moved with the practiced grace of a noblewoman, well versed in the visual languages of status. She wore vestola, a long pelted dress that signaled her respectable status as a married woman of the upper class. Draped elegantly over her shoulders was a palla, a large flowing shawl that served as a cloak for public excursions. Her attire was a showcase of Roman opulence. She wore an extensive collection of jewelry with gold bangles and strands of shimmering pearls that clinked softly as she walked. Her hair was an architectural marvel, intricately intricately braided and piled high in an elaborate style that required hours of labor from her personal slaves. Together, the siblings were a living portrait of the old Roman order, dignified, wealthy, and deeply wary of the changes arriving at their gates. Valens let out a sharp, cynical chuckle that lacked any real mirth. Julius Caesar. He began, his voice tight with an edge of disbelief. I find it impossible to look upon this city without seeing what that man has done to us, to the very fabric of the elite. He bought his way into the hearts of the mob, Julia added, her eyes darting towards a passing group of sweepers. He made a staggering fortune from the plunder of Gaul and those incursions into Britain. But let us not forget he built his career on the backs of the creditors. He spent money he didn't have on lavish games just to hear the plebeians cheer his name. And who pays? And who pays for his, quote, generosity now? Sorry, hold on. Valens asked rhetorically, to fund his endless wars and keep his legions loyal, he bleeds the patricians dry with heavy levies, however you say that. Then, as if to spit in our faces, he passes reforms that cancel a quarter of all debts. He isn't just winning a war, he's bankrupting the lender class to buy the soul of the republic. Julia nodded, her gold jewelry chiming softly. He uses Roman wealth to empower the rabble and his own soldiers, bypassing the Senate entirely. Land distribution, public works, it's all a bribe. He is even courting the equites, funding the business class specifically to undermine our supposed monopolies of power. He calls us entrenched oligarchs, while he styles himself the defender of the common man. Her voice rose in a momentary flash of anger. The Republican ideals of elections and the constitutions had become mere facades for his reign. He is no longer a magistrate. He is a tyrant, an autocrat draped in the general's cloak. Valens suddenly stopped walking, lowering his voice to a calm, professional whisper that commanded attention. The Senate and the Optimates have tried to check him, Julia, since 55 BCE, and every day since he took the dictatorship, we have sought a way to bind him to the law. The Senate is fractured. Many are too cowardly to act, and the rest have been replaced by his hand-picked sycophants. He leans in closer. He is clever. He uses the popular assemblies to formalize his power, giving his tyranny a veneer of legal sanction. He even broke the ancient sanctity of the tribunes, intimidating the very men who are meant to be untouchable. He has made the veto, our greatest shield, utterly irrelevant. Julia let out a long, very breath, her voice falling into a hushed, somber tone. Besides, Valens, what is the point of a dictator in these times anyways? We have consuls. We have the law. Why must one man hold the world in his palm? Valens maintained his measured, professional tone, the cadence of a man who had spent years debating in the Senate. He spoke not just to his sister, but to the very heir of the Republic he felt slipping away. Rome was never meant to be the playground of one man. Valens began softly. We are, or were, a delicate balance, a republic that blended the authority of the few with the voice of the many, to ensure that tyranny could never again take roots on the Palatine Hill. We moved away from the darkness of the old kings to a system governed by the Senate, the magistrates, and the assemblies of the people. He glanced at her, ensuring she was following the gravity of his point. You remember the rhythm of our years, Julia? The annual elections for councils? Julia matched his composure. Her voice becoming as formal and steady as his. I do. The very heartbeat of the city. Exactly. Valens continued. The councils were the summit of our world. The supreme magistrate, the commanders. Sorry, hold on. The supreme magistrates, the commanders of our legions, the heads of our governments, two men elected together for a single year. It was a dual system born of wisdom, two men, so that no single man could ever dream himself a man. One could always cast a veto to block the madness of the other. Julia nodded slowly. A system built on the fear of absolute power. When our ancestors overthrew the kings, they didn't just change the names of their leaders, they divided the crown in two so that every action was checked and every ambition was countered. She looked towards the distant forum, her expression darkening. And now, Caesar holds both halves of that crown in a single hand. Valens spoke with a cold academic precision, as if analyzing a fatal wound. The office of dictator was never meant to be a career, Julia. It was a burden, an extraordinary magistracy granted for one specific crisis, and one alone. A man was endowed with the state's full authority to fix a broken wall or win a desperate war, subordinating everyone, councils included, to that single purpose. And the moment the task was done, he was expected to lay those powers down and return to his plow as a private citizen. He stopped, turning to face her with a grimace. In the worst emergencies, the law allows for 6 months. 6 months of absolute power to save Rome from herself, or at least until the emergency has been resolved. But Caesar, Fallon spat the name. He has played a different game. He has been granted extension after extension for 4 years. He hasn't resolved the crisis. He has moved into the office of dictator and barred the door behind him. He treats the administration of the world as his personal inheritance. Julia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. Then the title, the evening breeze. No, sorry. Julia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late morning breeze. Sorry, my bad, guys. Sorry, typo. Sorry, guys. Julia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late morning breeze. Then the title is a lie, she replied, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. He isn't fixing a problem. He is ruling. That isn't an emergency measure, Valence. That is a whole new level of borderline kingly power.